Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Daniel Perlman, and I am the Programs Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. Classrooms Without Borders works with over 125 schools in Pittsburgh, West Virginia, Ohio, and Sarasota, Florida. We offer study travel seminars for educators to Europe and Israel, and we offer in-school and community programs on topics relating to Jewish history, Israel, the Holocaust, genocide, and hate. We're so excited to welcome Daniel Lee, author of The SS Officer's Armchair, to this lecture. In addition to our educators, study seminar participants, and many Pittsburghers, we have people calling in from over 20 US states and many, many countries, including some of which were written in the chat before: Austria, Canada, England, and so many others. Thank you all for coming. In a moment, I will turn it over to Michal Friedman, the Jack Buncher Professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of History at Carnegie Mellon University, to introduce our speakers today. In the meantime, for those who have not yet purchased the SS Officer's Armchair, Classic Lines Bookstore in Squirrel Hill has copies for sale. To order the book, send an email to classiclinesbooks@gmail.com. The books will be available for pickup, delivery, or shipping following the event. At the end of today's lecture, we will have time for questions and answers from the audience. Due to the number of people on this call, we ask that you please use the Zoom chat feature to privately message me your questions for the speaker. I will ask Daniel as many questions from everyone as time allows, and please keep your audio muted throughout the duration of this program. Thank you again, everyone, and Michal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel, for your kind introduction, and it's always a pleasure partnering for Classrooms Without Borders on events, and which always allows us to reach a broad array of engaged audience, as we can witness today from seeing people from so many places that have joined. So before I introduce our speakers, I just would like to quickly share with you information about an event taking place next Sunday, a week from today in the evening. We're organizing at Carnegie Mellon a concert. As for those of you who are joining us from Pittsburgh, I don't have to tell you, but it's the second year commemoration of the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue. And we're organizing a concert with the title Pittsburgh Remembers, Reclaiming the Voices of Suppressed Jewish Composers of the Nazi Era. And the concert is honoring the victims and survivors of the massacre of the Tree of Life Synagogue. And we will have music from the Clarion Quartet, who are all members of the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra, who are going to play this genre of band music of Jewish composers who are banned by the Nazi regime. And we'll have some appearances. Again, it'll be a virtual event that will be live streamed, and Daniel at Classrooms Without Borders actually will have the event on their website, since I know most of you have registered for this event, so you'll be able to access that information. But you can also look at the Department of Music Facebook event and general publicity about it. So that's it, because I want to turn to our speakers. And I have the pleasure to introduce them. And Daniel Lee, who I had the pleasure of meeting very briefly in Oxford several years ago, shortly after I heard about some exciting new book that he was working on. And Daniel Lee is a historian of the Second World War and a specialist in the history of Jews in France and North Africa during the Holocaust. He's a senior lecturer in modern history at Queen Mary, University of London. In his new book, The SS Officer's Armchair, The Secret Life, Uncovering the Secret Life of a Nazi, is about a remarkable discovery of a swastika-covered documents that had been found inside the cushion of an armchair that was being repaired by an upholsterer in Amsterdam, and tracking down the history of the chair in an incredible detective work and archival work, and including interviews with the children of this perpetrator. There are documents of the SS officer, Dr. Robert Grestinger, was the sort of focus of this book. Daniel Lee his account takes us from Amsterdam to Stuttgart, Prague, and even to New Orleans. And just to add that the book illuminates the social and political formation of upper middle class Germans, young Germans during the Weimar Republic, It gives us sort of a whole new perspective into the life of what I think Daniel at some point refers to this in the book as a sort of a desk, office desk Nazi. So it really expands on sort of previous literature about some of these perpetrators who are not as prominent as some of the other perpetrators who have gained most of the attention. And today Daniel is going to be in conversation with my dear colleague, Emanuela Grama, who's an associate professor of anthropology and history in the history department at Carnegie Mellon University. And her recently published book, Socialist Heritage, The Politics of Past and Place in Romania, just won the 2020 Ed Hewitt Prize for an outstanding monograph dealing with the political economy of Russia, Eurasia, or Eastern Europe. So with no further ado, I turn it over to Emma and Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you, Michal.
Thank you, Michal. So, Dan, it's so wonderful to see you. Full disclosure to everyone in the audience, Dan and I have known each other since 2011, so we are good friends and colleagues. And I'm going to invite you to go back in time to that very famous party that you threw together with your roommate, apartment mate, Justin, right? At the beginning of our postdoctoral year in Florence. And I remember it was sometime in October. It was really warm already, still. And so Michal already mentioned the documents, right? But I would like us to hear more about the story. How did you hear about the documents? And also, yeah, so let's start with that. Let's
Absolutely.
move back to October 2011.
Many, many moons ago. Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you, Michal. Thank you, Daniel, for this marvelous opportunity to speak to so many people in Pittsburgh and beyond. So yes, to answer Emma, your question, you were there right at the start. So as Emma said, I was just new to Florence. I'd only just arrived from England, just finished a PhD, again on Jews in Vichy, France. And I found myself in Florence without knowing too many people. And then within a couple of weeks, my friend who I was living with at the time and we organized this big party to get to know lots of other historians and researchers who happened to be in the city. And it's at that point that a woman who was also new came up to me and said, "Oh, I hear you're a historian of the Second World War. Something had just happened to my mother, and I think this would be very interesting for you." And, I just remember pausing and thinking how, people, when you're a historian of Second World War, people come up to you very often and they want to share stories with you. People tell you about, grandfathers who were in concentration camps or aunts who were in the resistance or whatever. But these stories are usually from 70, 80 years ago. Things don't just happen to somebody's mother. Anyway, so it was at that point that she just told me that her mother in Amsterdam had taken this old armchair to be reupholstered a few weeks earlier. And when she went to collect it in person in Amsterdam, the guy who was doing the repair work, he was very cross and he was sort of, "What is this? I don't understand. I don't do work for Nazis or their families." And this woman was totally sort of, "What are you talking about? Absolutely, are you mad?" Anyway, and at that point, he just presented her with all these documents that he had discovered sewn into the cushion of her armchair, all of which were covered in swastikas and all of which belonged to one man called Robert Giesinger from Stuttgart, who was in Prague during the Second World War. And this man doing the work on the chair just thought, well, this must be your father or your grandfather. And he was totally confused. But it so turned out that this woman had actually purchased the chair when she was a student. She didn't inherit it or anything like that. She had no idea who this man was. So they just basically brought me all these documents, and they just wanted to know, who was this man and how on earth did his documents end up sewn inside the cushion of their armchair that they'd had for years. Like I said, they'd bought it in the 60s. she was a student. She just needed some cheap secondhand furniture, like all of us did once upon a time, to furnish our student apartment, beds, tables, chairs, cushion, whatever. And so she just had this. And in the 80s, when some families were allowed to leave communist Czechoslovakia, they could take certain objects with them. And that one of these objects that she'd had for many, many years was this armchair. So she's had it for all these years. And after so long, she finally decided to get reupholstered. And so that's where the story basically begins.
Okay, so basically it's somehow the project found you, right? I mean, it's a really unusual often for historians for the sources to come to them.
Yeah,
especially
usually it's the other way around.
From the pillar of an armchair, right? In the sense that, well, often you find yourself in the archives and you come across some documents that eventually lead you on a totally new trajectory. And often, relatively, that sometimes it happens. If you are lucky, that happens. But this is really unusual. But so tell us a bit more about Griesinger. So who was he? And I was thinking perhaps that you can offer us a bit of overview of his particular trajectory so that we actually offer some more specific context about Griesinger. And this is where I would appreciate if we could have the set of images that Dan already shared with us shown on the screen. So the audience has a visual context for our conversation. And once those images are shown, then we move into talking more about the story.
All right, so while we're doing that, I'll answer the question. So from the documents discovered in the armchair, it was, there were only sort of bits and pieces that gave some kind of biographical information. There was enough to sort of begin with. In terms of being a historian, I knew which archives to go to. But, if you sort of put his name into Google or look in some books, there's nothing whatsoever on this man. This man wasn't Hitler, Himmler, or whoever, any of these very famous Nazis that everybody knows about. The documents just sort of said that his name was Robert Griesinger. He had a PhD in law. He was from Stuttgart. And he was a lawyer in Prague during the Second World War. There was no evidence that he had a family or anything like that. Actually, it sort of, where there was a space for him to write wives and children's names, it was blank. So at first I did think he was a bachelor. But, I went to Prague very, very quickly. I was very interested in learning. Well, I was very fascinated by the chair. I really wanted to write the story of this chair at first. But then it became sort of clear that the man was actually more interesting to me than the chair itself. But, I nevertheless wanted to know as much as I could about the chair. Was it a chair that was made in Prague? Was it from Stuttgart? Was it a chair that was perhaps once belonged to a Jewish family in France or Belgium and shipped east? Because we know that this happened time and time again. So much furniture was stolen from Jewish families in Western Europe and then shipped to sort of replenish or either German families whose homes had been bombed or to furnish the new offices that were springing up all over Central and Eastern Europe during that time. So I was very interested in sort of going around Prague and finding out what I could. So I bought with, 25 big pictures in color of the armchair, and I would just sort of walk around Prague and go to all these warehouses and atelier and what have you, and just sort of interview chair makers really, and just find out as much as I could, who would buy a chair like this? How much was it worth? The intended buyer, etc. How easy was it? And, time and time again, people would just tell me that this was very much a chair that was made in Prague. It was not very expensive. It would appeal to a conservative buyer, but nevertheless, in the 30s, it was the kind of thing that you could buy pretty much anywhere in Prague. And I remember one person even telling me, when I tried to get more information, I sort of said to him, well, inside of this chair, there were like hidden Nazi documents. And the guy just sort of, puffed on his cigarette, and he sort of looks at me and he's like, my friend, this was communist Czechoslovakia, for God's sake.
Everyone was doing this.
I find hidden things in chairs every single day. Like, I don't care about, who cares about your stupid, anyway. But when I was in Prague, that's when, of course, I started visiting the archives. I wanted to know as much as I could about this man, Robert Griesinger. And that's when I realized he was in the SS. The documents in the archives in Prague. There was no doubt about it. This wasn't obvious from the chair, from the archives I discovered inside the chair, but just being in Prague and, you know, knocking on a few doors there really gave me much more biographical information about him. I'm not sure if Dan's able to share with us these images, whether they're on their way.
I am. I can share them with you in just a second.
Okay. So whenever you've got a second. Anyway.
We will keep talking about Griesinger.
Yeah. Fine. I can talk all day about this armchair.
Yes.
Don't worry.
So,
We're not...
Well, so that's my question then. When did you, so the documents found you found yourself in Prague, you've been talking to all these craftsmen, and then you found out that he was part of the SS. So when did you know you are going to write a book about him?
Well,
was there, or let me put it this way, was there a very particular moment when you thought, oh, I've come across enough information that it's particularly fascinating, I'm going to write a book? Or it was kind of gradual?
No, first, you're right. No, you're right to ask the question. At first, you know, I didn't, of course, this was never meant to be a book. This was meant to be sort of, you know, a little bit of fun, just sort of, you know, maybe it was going to be an article or, you know, a 5-page thing for a magazine. It was never going to be a book. But then, of course, when I found myself in the archives in the Czech Republic, and I realized that unlike in Germany, where so much of the material was destroyed during the Second World War, either by the Nazis themselves at the end of the war, when they deliberately burnt so many of their papers, which was the case with the SS, or by Allied bombing. Of course, there was Allied bombing. Dan, I think, are you still uploading these pictures? Because I think we can just see your computer at the moment.
You can't see the...
I can't. I can only see your computer. But anyway, it doesn't matter. I can continue with my story and you can figure this out.
I think it's coming up.
Okay. But anyway, so no, the moment was really after like plowing through the archives in the Czech Republic. Here we are. Thanks, Dan. So here we have, that's the picture of the armchair. This is the armchair itself, in which was discovered all of these documents inside the cushion. Obviously, this is the new cushion, which has, you know, subsequently been, you know, redone. But you can see from the chair, it's sort of, you know, well, it's very, very light. It's, as I said earlier, it's the kind of thing that today are extremely cheap. Like you walk into a secondhand shop in Prague and these chairs are like right at the back of the shop. Like nobody wants these. They're very old fashioned and they're just, there's nothing special about them today. So that's the first image. And then I think the second image, perhaps we could show when you've got a moment, is of one of the documents discovered in the armchair, which is one of the first pieces of information I had. So, you know, very handsome man in his 30s. You can't see it too clearly here, but he's got this big scar across that runs down from his cheek. It's not the best quality picture. But, you know, I was very fascinated to know, you know, how on earth he got that scar. And that's something I discovered later on. And as you see here, the bits, you know, no mention of wife or children or anything like that. But no, to answer your question, I did lots of research in the Czech Republic. I did lots of research in Germany. You know, I was able to go to the SS archives, and I was very fortunate that the archives, his file wasn't destroyed, because so much of the SS sort of individual files and boxes on individual SS men were destroyed during the war. So more than half, of course. So I was very lucky that his wasn't destroyed. So that obviously gave me a glimpse into his life and what a fascinating life he had. You know, his obviously his professional life, but also his personal life. You know, it told me all kinds of stories about the woman he wanted to marry, and the daughters who he would have with her in the 1930s. But then, of course, you know, I was sort of struggling to get more personal stories from these very bureaucratic, technical, administrative archives. And so I remember one day finding myself so frustrated by all these silences that I just, you know, picked up the phone book to Stuttgart, and I just phoned every single person in Stuttgart with this last name, Griesinger, because I thought, oh, maybe I could find his daughters. But, you know, they obviously had married and had taken their husband's name, and so it was totally impossible to find them. So, you know, I was just phoning everybody, and they all, of course, they thought I was completely crazy and I was trying to sell them something. But then eventually somebody did say, oh yes, Robert Griesinger, that was my father's brother. You know, why do you want to talk to, you know, I was like, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe that I'd actually discovered a living relative. But he invited me to his house the next day. Mm-hmm. And I think it was at this moment when I started finding family members and talking to them, but that's probably it was at that point that I thought, okay, there's a big story to tell here. This isn't just, you know, a few papers in an armchair. It goes way beyond this to kind of understand the mentality of a whole generation of people like Robert Griesinger.
So you almost anticipated my question, my next question. So at one moment you call him, he initially appeared at least as a rather unspectacular civil servant, right? And then more, especially once you met Joachim, his nephew, and then eventually Utah and Barbara, then he becomes more and more of a complex person, very full of contradictions as well. But at the same time, there is something that seems to be almost like that it's already, you know, his upbringing is almost foreshadowing his eventual, you know, professional trajectory, and especially his full embrace, you know, of Nazis, right? He joined the SS, right? The most prestigious and most powerful organization of the Nazi party. So, to what extent you would say that Griesinger was following a given path that would be shared by a whole generation? And to what extent do you think he was rather unusual?
Well, he was unusual in the sense that coming to this story, I had just presumed that somebody like him was, you know, 100% German, and that his parents were German and that his grandparents were German, etc. But even being in the SS archives in Berlin and looking through his family tree very early, I see that this just wasn't the case. And, you know, his father was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, in 1871. And, you know, I traced back his lineage to sort of the 1720s in New Orleans. And I went to New Orleans and tried to find out as much as I could about the family there, and, you know, sort of the numbers of people in his family, men and women, who owned enslaved people, generations. You know, some of them had sort of 150 enslaved people working on their land, whereas others would only have one or two. But I was very fascinated in this background and in this life, and how connected he was to this world, because his American grandmother, Lena, actually lived with the family. They all moved from New Orleans in the 80s, when, you know, after the Civil War and Reconstruction, the South was just in such a terrible place, and people would sort of look over to Europe and Bismarck and think, oh, how fantastic, you know. So, you know, it's this kind of like reverse migration that perhaps we don't spend enough time thinking about as historians. We often think, oh, the Europeans went to America and that was the end of that. But we actually forget that so many Europeans did go back at one stage or another. But, you know, he did nevertheless come from this very right-wing, conservative, nationalist, deeply anti-Semitic, anti-communist background. His father was a military man. And, you know, one of the amazing moments for me in this story was when I was able to I suppose it was to build up enough trust with his family that they would allow me access to their papers. Because, of course, the first time I went to their house, and I sort of said, oh, thank you so much. I was there for hours, and they were telling me all the family stories about Griesinger and everything. And I said, oh, do you have any documents? And they're like, oh, no, I don't think we do. I'm sorry about that. I said, okay, never mind. But, you know, this is something you tell your students. You know, people aren't going to hand you over bundles of documents the first time you meet them. It was sort of, you need to develop a relationship with these people. You know, I knew that, you know, this is an old house. It was a house that the family has lived in for 100 years. There's papers coming out of everywhere. Every single drawer is overspilling, but, you know, you don't push it. But anyway, so once they got to trust me a bit more and they realized that I was writing a book and I was interested, they did start to share more information with me. So, for example, one of the most amazing documents I had access to was Griesinger's mother's diary. She kept a diary from the day he was born and recorded, you know, long passages every single day. And that was able to give me a real sense of his family background, the family that he grew up in. And the kind of man he was, the kind of boy and teenager that he was. These are extremely precious details to understand his mentality. He's born in 1906, and this is such an important time because he was too young to fight in the First World War. He was a child. And, this is what historians call this war youth generation. These guys who grew up and found themselves during the First World War, but didn't actually fight in it. And of course, Germany wasn't occupied during the First World War. So the end of the war came as such a shock to this whole generation of young men and women, of course, in 1918, 1919. It really was, for so many of them, the humiliation and just sort of the total chaos that ensued. It marked their life in such an important way and really shaped them. So to answer back to your question, he's coming from this right-wing monarchist nationalist family in the Southwest of Germany. He's not from Berlin or Munich or whatever. He's from the Southwest. There are plenty of right-wing nationalist parties that exist at that time, plenty of anti-communist organizations. He didn't have to be a Nazi. There was nothing inevitable about this. On the contrary, when you look at the Southwest, even something as basic as, people who joined the Nazi party, or if you look at general election results from the elections, people weren't flocking to the Nazis in the way that they were in other parts of Germany. So there is nothing inevitable about his trajectory. On the contrary, he didn't join the party until extremely late, until 1937. And he probably only joined the SS because he saw it as a way to improve his chances in the civil service, in his career. So what I'm trying to get at here is, yes, he did bet on the Nazi horse in 1933. He bet on that horse thinking it was the right horse, but he probably didn't do it out of sort of a desire to sort of agree with the ideology in itself, because there would have been many elements that he probably didn't approve of, but he was happy to go, it was very thuggish, for example. And, he's from this very sort of upper class Protestant military background. And, who are these thugs and this little Hitler or whatever? It wouldn't have been natural necessarily for him, but nevertheless, he found enough in it for him to go along with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is what I found fascinating, that he is in fact so shrewd in really forging very particular connections for himself, right? So there is a very interesting balance, well, if you can call it this way, between, beliefs and pure pragmatic interest for him to belong to the best place. Especially because I found the way how you describe him, right? There is, it seems that he was, you call him at one moment, he's definitely not a genius, right? But he comes across as someone who was very good at really forging very particular connections at no matter what price. So he was
coming at university. He's very fortunate that he scrapes through high school. He's not particularly brilliant, but anyway, he manages somehow to get into this very good the most right-wing university in Germany at the time. There were no Jews, no Jewish professors on the faculty, no Jewish students. But his dream, and his mother writes about this in her diary, is to join one of these fraternities, these dueling, these young men with their swords and what have you.
We have an image about that, I think, if Daniel would like to show it. But yeah.
Sure, yes. Is that image number 3, Emma?
Yes, I also think I can also show some of the images while we are talking, if that's okay.
Okay, I'm happy to see any images. I'm not sure which ones we've got, so this will be great.
Yeah, but it's the corpse, right? The fact that he's part of this very special fraternity at the
right. So he's very, he joins this fraternity, and all they do is sort of drink a ridiculous amount of beer, and invite young women back to their student dorms, and. But no, one of the most important aspects of it is that he wanted to get this scar on his face. This was like an extremely
that's quite the
important part of core life. So, he would sort of be encouraging the person with whom he was fighting, get me here. And as soon as, the the tip of the sword would, you know, cut into the wound and the flesh would be exposed. At that point, he would sort of reach in and grab some salt and put salt into his wound in order for him to appear sort of, you know, more manly and etc. Okay, so this is the image that you can see on the screen now is of one of the houses in New Orleans that one of his American relatives sent a postcard to Germany, probably in about 1905, 1910, something like that. Just actually, this is it, just as an example, Emma, just to show you that, you know, when the family did leave America, they still maintained connections with their relatives, the aunts, uncles, cousins, back in New Orleans. So it wasn't as though the families were cut off. He knew he had American family. This is very clear from looking at his SS file. What other photos?
Daniel, yeah, I think that's fantastic to keep looking through the images, and then we come back to the conversation.
So we have for example, in her diary, in his mother's diary, she would often clip photographs from that day, or she would clip newspaper cuttings that she found interesting. I mean, you can't see it very clearly here, but he's the little boy on the right clinging to his mother's leg, and he's had a little younger brother who's in the mother's arms. And then the letter, it's just an envelope below, which you can see that's the last letter that, it never actually made it out of Germany, but his parents sent it to him in Prague, in Nazi-occupied Prague, but it got returned, it was like returned to sender. So he never actually received this letter. But it was his parents' sort of last words to their son, because they thought that the Americans or the Soviets were about to bomb Stuttgart to smithereens. Okay, and in this picture, so those are his parents here. So as I said, this very, you know, old military man, conservative, you know, very monarchist, you know, didn't have time for Hitler or anything like that. He had sworn loyalty to the king, and that for him, you know, was his be all and end all. So that's the military man. That's Guisinger's father on the right, and the mother is on the left. And here is the wedding picture. So this, again, from the archives, what's amazing is, you know, that this picture, this event even took place because, you know, he fell in love with this woman from Hamburg. So this is, we see here in February 1936, the day they got married. But, you know, they tried to get married from September 1935. But because he was in the SS, he couldn't just get married the next day or the next week. You know, to be in the SS, you needed permission from Berlin. You needed permission from Himmler. But this is just something that took weeks and weeks and months. There were so many bureaucratic hurdles to jump through, not least, for example, because she needed to prove that she could be a good SS wife mentally and physically. So she would have to go to an SS doctor, and they would have to sort of measure her hips and like check her period cycle to make sure that she would be able to have 4 healthy German Aryan children, and obviously check that she didn't have any sort of Jewish or any other sort of non-Aryan background in her. So the whole process did take a long, long time. And a lot of Nazi men, a lot of SS men did actually break up with their girlfriends, we see, because it just was dragging on for way too long. And here's a family portrait from Prague. So from 1943, they'd sent this picture home. But perhaps we'll talk about Prague in a minute.
Right. So thank you, Daniel. Well, so now we definitely have a stronger visual framework for understanding his family and seeing some of the important people for him. So he is well, like you already mentioned, right? He is really going up in ranks, both as a civil servant. Also, to what extent his family approved of his SS membership? To what extent was that an element of tension in his own family?
Well, what's amazing is that, I mean, perhaps I'm not sure, I can see we're like flying through the time, so I'm not sure.
That's why we are moving towards
but to answer your question, like, even like today, you know, having interviewed his daughters and being in such close contact with them, I remember the first couple of times I met them, you know, they had absolutely no idea. You know, their father, it's certainly not a spoiler for me to say, because I say it on the first page of the book, but, you know, Robert Guisinger died in Prague in 1945, in September 45, and his wife and children were able to leave the city a few months earlier. But all the point of me saying this is that his daughters grew up without a father. They were little girls. They were 5 and 8 when he died. They retained only, scattered memories, a handful of memories of their father. But they had, they were like so many German children in the 1940s and 50s. Whenever they tried to ask questions of the older generation, they were very often met with this wall of silence. Like, no, we don't talk about the war. We don't talk about the past. So a lot of children sort of grew up knowing very, very little about what their parents had done during the 1930s and 1940s. So when I did come along and start talking to them, they had very, very little information when it came to their father's relationship with the Nazi Party. They said they had absolutely no idea that he was in the Nazi Party, and certainly no idea that he'd ever been in the SS. This was all news to them. So, Griesinger and the SS, one of the biggest surprises for me in this book was actually learning more about the SS and thinking, you go into a bookshop and you see so many books on the SS. And I think, what could I possibly say about this organization that hasn't already been said? But my God, when you actually start delving into it, you sort of see that we, as historians, we've still only skimmed the surface. This is the most remarkable organization. And there still needs to be so much more work by historians to really understand the nature of this organization. So somebody like Robert Griesinger, for example, yes, he had an SS uniform, but he didn't wear it every day. It was people who were sort of, the Waffen-SS, like the killers who were like going out into the East during the Second World War and massacring Jews. Or, for example, the concentration camp guards. These were the guys, the permanent full-time members of the SS who would be taking an SS salary and who would be wearing their uniforms every day. Whereas for somebody like Robert Griesinger, the evidence is sort of, there's no doubt about it. He would sort of dip his toe into the SS. He would pay his membership fee. He'd get the right to have a uniform and be a member, but then it was really up to him how much he wanted to invest in it. And what we see with him and thousands of other doctors, lawyers, civil servants is that a lot of them just weren't actually that committed. A lot of them, they would go to meetings where they would sort of listen to talks and they would be encouraged to bring their families. There'd be all kind of family events for SS wives, SS children. But at the end of the day, it was never a full-time thing for people like that. Robert Griesinger still had a full-time job as a lawyer in Stuttgart in the 1930s. He was working at the Gestapo. He was a lawyer for the Gestapo during the 30s. So the SS was something which was more on the side for him. And we only ever see him becoming involved in it when he's looking to get promoted. So it kind of served.
That's exactly right. What I was thinking about, right? That it's important to see the very pragmatism of the choices that many of these people made, right? So the membership in the SS helped them advance socially and politically. So ideology mattered less. He was rather on the side as long as it helped them make the most of their career. So it's a fascinating, crude pragmatism in a way that informs Griesinger's own choices. And I wanted to, we will probably not have the time to talk too long, but I wanted to tell you that I have enjoyed your book so much, not only because it's so powerfully, poignantly written, but I really appreciated how you tried to offer some, complexity and ambivalence to Griesinger as a whole person, right? So you presented him to us through, it's like a kind of a very complex system of mirrors. He comes across to us from the archives, for some of the archives you found, also especially from the stories that others shared with you. But what moved me most was that there was a certain kind of empathy through which you approached him. Not necessarily that you would condone his actions.
Now you're putting it on here.
I think we are actually boomed.
Was that our first experience of being?
No, that was someone in the audience who unmuted themselves when they logged on. I removed them.
I see. Okay, thank you. So yes, I'm going to really actually wrap up our conversation so we have time for questions. But I want the last question to you, Dan, would be, how did you feel to spend 7 years almost writing this book? You are, you know, a British Jew, also a historian, and at the same time, you had been searching for all these traces of a man that was directly involved, right? Well, indirectly involved in organization of surveillance and terror that eventually personally affected you and your family.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there's, you know, this is something that I would think about every day. You know, I was carrying around his papers in my jacket for years. You know, these original documents that were discovered in the archives, and I was in the Armchair. You know, what would he have thought if he knew that, you know, this British Jew had his papers, you know, so close to him for all these years? No, but anyway, you know, the guy. He was, at the end of the day, he was a Nazi. He signed up for the program. He worked full-time at the SS, full-time at the Gestapo in the 1930s. You know, I'm not excusing him in any way. The guy was, you know, he was a despicable human being. And, you know, it was very easy for him just to sort of turn a blind eye to so many other things that was going on in his life. So just to give an example of the Gestapo, you know, he's a lawyer there, but a lot of what he's responsible for doing is to make sure that people would be brought in to the building in the center of Stuttgart to be tortured. Now, you know, even today in Stuttgart, I met elderly people who refuse to walk past the Gestapo building. They don't even take that street because of the stories that they heard as children, because of what went on in the torture chambers in the basement was so harrowing to them. So Griesinger, okay, he's not getting his hands dirty there. You know, he's upstairs, my goodness, he is upstairs typing away at his desk, you know, his on his, I was about to say laptop, on his typewriter, knowing all too well what on earth is taking place in the torture cells beneath him. And then again, we see this time and again when he gets to Prague, we see that, you know, we haven't had an opportunity really to talk about Prague, but what he's doing in Prague is he's responsible, entirely responsible, for sending away Czech workers to go and work for Germany. This involved, and also for making sure some Czech Jews were also working for the benefit of the Reich. You know, the guy was, he was absolutely awful what he was doing, and on no occasion do we see him ever trying to protect ordinary Jewish people or whoever. So, you know, and I suppose, sorry, finally, the other example, which is which actually becomes deeply personal, is when he is a soldier invading the USSR. What we see is, and this is something, you know, the archives were so clear about this, the way in which he and members of his unit were responsible for carrying out such terrible acts against the local Jewish population in Ukraine. We've thought for so many years, even historians, that the German army that invaded Ukraine in July 1941 were sort of conducting this gentlemanly war where they would go in and they would only fight against the Red Army. But, you know, this is total nonsense when we look at you know, the archival evidence that so many brilliant historians over the last 20 years have shown, that so many men like Griesinger who were in the army were slaughtering Jews. And this is something they wrote about in their letters home. And so what's amazing for me, I don't know if we have much time left, but I'll just quickly say it anyway, is that on one occasion, we see him sort of going to Ukraine, going towards Kiev. And my family came to Britain from a very small shtetl in Ukraine at the beginning of the 20th century. So as I'm plotting Griesinger's route across the largest country in Europe, it was just amazing for me to actually see that he actually went through the shtetl that my great-grandfather had left behind, you know, relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, etc., and that Griesinger actually had to stay there for a week in July 1941 because the weather was so terrible and they had problems advancing. So, no, I had to really, you know, for years, I was like wondering about obviously my relationship with him, so to speak. And this came up again with his daughters as well, whenever I would interview them.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this conversation. Now we are actually going to take some questions from the audience. Thank you so much for the questions. So I'm going to raise each question in the order that I am receiving them in the chat. So Jeff asked, why would he hide his documents in a chair? Was it common for Nazis to hide documents in chairs? And this is actually overlapping with a question from Elena, who was also adding another question, was he trying to hide his involvement or protect his legacy for posterity?
So in terms of the documents that were hidden, I should have perhaps been more explicit at the start. These documents were deeply personal. These were very, very important papers. These weren't sort of, you know, old bus tickets or something that he'd taken the bus once. You know, these were his passports, his PhD in law, stocks and shares that had never even been cashed, etc. So the kind of identity papers that one would struggle to live without. Look, the chances are that it was spring 1945 that these documents were placed into the armchair. Okay, there was no note with them. So it's only, you know, it's only me as a historian having to come up with the most likely situation. And that, for me, the answer is spring 1945, this moment that after 6 years of brutal occupation in Prague, that the people, either the Czech partisans with some help from the invading Russian army, were able to sort of really rise up against the Germans. And so that we have this moment in spring 1945 where sort of to look German, to sound German, to be German, it would have been a terrible thing while in Prague at that time. Lots, you know, the archives are very explicit, time and again, of Germans, you know, being rounded up, being beaten, sometimes even worse, all of whom being thrown into camps. So the situation was really, really quite terrible. Obviously not as bad as how it was for the Czechs during the brutal regime of the Nazis for 6 years, but nevertheless, it was an awful place to be a German in spring 1945. And so it was at that moment, you know, the last document goes up to 1945. So it is very likely that it was that moment that the documents were placed into the armchair. Look, I've thought about this time and time again for so many years about how he did it, if it were him, if somebody had done it with him. And you know, it's a great question. I don't want to give too much away here, but it is something I discuss at length in the book.
Especially, absolutely, yes. So there is a very interesting question from Karen in Pittsburgh. Did those who refuse to talk to you as they question your premise talk to him after the book was published? So basically, there are some characters who refuse to talk, right? That's his stepson, for instance, that Utah told you that you shouldn't approach, and then Walter, Gisela's the husband. And so after the book was published, have you actually had the chance to hear from these people again?
Funny. What's the name of the person who's asked me this question?
Karen in Pittsburgh.
Unbelievable, because just this week I've had emails from relatives who at the time were not very forthcoming, shall we say, but nevertheless in the last week I've actually been Skyping, having conversations with people who have now read the book and sort of wished that they had spoken to me earlier, because they've been sharing documents, sharing stories with me. I mean, look, the argument doesn't change. You know, he's still you know, a despicable human being. So no matter what I hear, it's not going to change any of that. But nevertheless, it's just absolutely fantastic that my book is making people think a little bit more. And look, let's hope. I'm very fortunate that it's being translated into quite a few languages, including German. So I'm really looking forward to what happens when the book comes out in German and how people react to me then.
I think that would be a fascinating conversation after the reaction and the reception of the book. One more question from Lee Ann in Pittsburgh. What complexities were revealed about the experience of living under Nazi rule through your research? So if you came across...
I can give a wonderful example, something that really, you know, those moments where as historians, you just sort of sit up and you think, oh my God, how is that possible? And for me, the example would be the fact that in 1936, 37, 38, Griesinger lived next door to a Jewish family. And at that time, he was in the SS, he was a Nazi, he was working at the Gestapo. And I just was totally amazed that something like that could ever happen. The fact that, you know, in my mind, this just doesn't make any sense. People should be separate according to what we know about the Third Reich, blah, blah, blah. But no, you know, I went to visit the house. I was so amazed by having seen this in the archives. And I wondered, what did it mean to live next door to a Jewish family? Does it mean you live sort of, you know, 200 yards away? Like, what does next door actually mean physically? So I went to the street, I knocked on the door, I spoke to the owners of the house. And the house is built in such a way that there was just a wall. There's one wall. So the Jewish family are on this side and the Griesinger family are on the other side. And again, I was able to track down this family and I was able to talk to the granddaughter of this family who sort of were under, you know, she made it very clear that her grandparents led an Orthodox Jewish life, that they would have had a mezuzah on their doorframe, that they would have lit the candles on Friday night. You know, this was something that for her would definitely have happened. So this idea that you know, you could have a Nazi living next door a Jewish family, for me, that would probably, in terms of carrying out everyday life, for me, that was probably the biggest sort of jaw-dropping moment. And I talk about this in the book, and I talk about what happened to this family because we became very interested in them and what happened to them during the Second World War.
Just to comment on that, you come across as an amazing detective in trying to really trace down all the possible connections, including his former, you know, pupils, the former peers in his primary school and so on. So it's a fantastic investigation.
Well, there was one, thanks, that's really kind, but it was a lot of work. But yeah, there was this one Jewish kid in his class at school. You know, there were only, I think, Stuttgart wasn't one of these German cities with a big historic Jewish population. Stuttgart was not Berlin or Frankfurt or anything like that. There were only ever sort of 4,000 or maybe 5,000 Jews there. So he went to this very fancy school, boys' school in Stuttgart. And there was only one Jewish guy in his class. So I was really fascinated to know more about this guy, if ever I could hear more about, you know, what this young man had ever thought about. His name was Hugo Stern, and he actually ended up, very luckily, moving to Syracuse during the 1930s. He lost his job, he was a doctor. And anyway, but again, I was very fortunate to be able to interview Hugo Stern's children about their father and his memories of growing up in Stuttgart.
Thank you. So from Michelle, Michelle is asking, what was he thinking or hoping for when he put his papers inside the chair? What do you think?
Well, I'd love to know what you think, Emma, given that you've read the book so carefully and you're such a brilliant historian. This is something that, you know, you and I have talked about many, many times before. I'm obviously not putting you on the spot now, but look, I remember sitting there with his daughter, one of his daughters, and her just being so convinced that he was doing it for their family, that it's something he couldn't, there had to be a reason that he was doing it. It couldn't just be a spare of the moment thing or whatever. It was something that was thought about. There was a plan. It was done with the intention of maybe one day retrieving them or somebody else to retrieve them to pass on. It was something as a reminder that he had, you know, he didn't just burn them. These weren't something, you know, loads of Nazis in spring 1945 were burning and destroying documents and trying to escape and passing themselves off as Czech or Hungarian or whatever. But this isn't what happened here. These documents weren't burned. They were deliberately preserved. Were they preserved for his daughters? They would say yes.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely, it's obvious that at one moment he tried to go in hiding, right? And you allude to that towards the end of the book. So,
Yeah, he dies in a
but
hospital.
but at the same time, when you think about it, this where it's exactly as you put it in the book. These documents really represented in Nuce his life, and it was also a life that it wouldn't give away too much information. So maybe he was not willing to really burn those, right? It was basically like burning his own life, and it was very hard to make that choice. But these are just speculations, right? We will never know. But that doesn't mean that we should not really appreciate the research and thought that you put into this book, and making him present and real with his, and making his choices stand out, especially.
Yeah, and just what it meant for him as an enabler, as something, you know, that for me is one of the biggest takeaways of this book. Like, this book isn't about, as I've said, like Hitler or Himmler or Heydrich or any of these very famous people that we already know about. Like, you know, what does it mean when we actually start to shed, you know, to turn the focus away from the people at the very top of the regime, and we actually start to look at people right down the bottom, what I would call these ordinary Nazis. And these are the guys who are enabling the very people at the top to sort of get up there and make these speeches and pass these laws or whatever. That for me was much more interesting than to write another book about a biography about a more famous Nazi.
This is a very important point, and it actually answers Mary's question to what extent he would be a collaborator. He was definitely an enabler and very much part of the system of terror and oppression. Michelle asks, can you please talk more about your sources of information? While we've been talking about that, but she asks a very important question: what was the most useful and what was the most surprising? And the last question is, did you use any genealogy sites to get in touch with people?
Genealogy sites? I don't. You mean like I've read about,
probably.
Yeah, no. How fascinating. You mean like with the saliva tests and stuff?
I think the way how I read the question is that she refers to sites such as the ancestry.com, you know, like the trees, the genealogical trees and so on.
I mean, maybe at the beginning, perhaps I might have looked to see if there was anything, but that's not, no, I don't think, I probably looked at first and saw that there was absolutely nothing there.
But what would you say that was the most surprising and the most useful source that you came across on?
Well, I remember being in the Czech Republic and being very surprised at how much material was actually there. Because as we said, as Michal, when she introduced me, you know, I'm a historian of France by training, France during the Second World War. And obviously, you know, in Germany, so much was destroyed, but in France, so much was like weeded out after the war. The French really wanted to make a very good sort of impression for the rest of the time. And so many documents that even had the word Jew from the Second World War were just taken from the archives in 1947, 48 and just destroyed. So anyway, so what a pleasure to be in the Czech Republic, in the archives there, and just finding so much material that just hadn't been sort of weeded carefully by state officials. You know, that for me was absolutely wonderful. And I do remember, you know, we're talking to the extent of me like looking through Griesinger's like job for one day and him just talking about beer bottles. And I thought, you know, you always read about archives having to make these very tough decisions about which documents to preserve, because sometimes you have to throw away archives because otherwise, you know, the world will just be one big archive. And I just remember laughing, reading about Griesinger's obsession with beer bottles, because there was so much glass that was so vital to the Nazi economy, that glass was so vital, and just so they were just sort of talking about the need to recycle, like people need to send their beer bottles back after they've drunk their beer or ordered their beer or whatever. And at one point, Griesinger got extremely cross with the whole country of Bulgaria because they were sending over Czech beer to Bulgaria and the Bulgarians weren't returning their beer bottles. So that gave me a lot of insight into his personality just through looking at, you know, something as random as a beer bottle. That was probably the most fun I had. But also in New Orleans as well, you know, that perhaps might be more genealogical if I think of it that way, like tracing the family tree upwards and across, coming across relatives, today people of color whose great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, oh no, in the case I found, it was a great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother had been enslaved by Griesinger's ancestor, and they had had a child together. And so I was able to discuss, I was able to meet this very long-lost cousin of Griesinger, a woman of color today in New York, and you know, to talk to her about the family from New Orleans, which was utterly fascinating and surprising.
And plus, that person was also found himself in Normandy, right, in 1944 as a soldier,
Right,
as an American soldier. So
Yeah.
it was, right, you mentioned that in the book. So there are so many really unusual elements about him,
Right.
and about this
Well, I
family.
think, you know, it's just one of these, another, you know, mine is obviously everybody's book. So many books do this, but it's just, you know, we think that we know the Second World War. We think we know the Nazis as historians, but there is still so much left to do. We're still only scratching the surface. So I do hope that, you know, this book offers, like, you know, some kind of modest contribution to the amazing scholarship that so many people are doing today on the war. I don't, you know, I still think there is a lot more, you know, big questions that need answering from the Second World War and the Holocaust.
Thank you. And the last question, and I would actually suggest that you don't give away everything, because there is a very important episode at the very end of the book about the cemetery scene, and I'm not going to talk more about that. I think everyone should get the book and read it, and then find the cemetery scene for themselves. But the question is from Linda, and it's a very direct question, but so poignant. How did Robert die?
So that's a great question. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't give too much away, because it is.
I don't think you should.
But I look, a lot of people were being killed in Prague at that time. Like I said, it was a very, very, very dangerous place to be a German. There was also a lot of disease going on in the camps. If Germans were caught, they would be rounded up into camps. And you know, the conditions were awful in these camps. There was a lot of famine, a lot of dysentery, a lot of all kinds of infectious diseases that were spreading in these camps. So much so that a lot of British and American journalists would actually, you know, write articles in the international press about how awful the Germans were being treated.
Right.
Which, you know, was not the case 2 years earlier when there were Jews being in these conditions. But anyway. That's for another day. But no, so yeah, he died in September 1945 in Prague in, shall we say, mysterious circumstances for now.
All right. Well, I think this is the last question, unless Daniel has another set of questions. It's also 12:06, so it's an hour since we have started this very important and poignant conversation. I think we are going to be wrapping up. And thank you so much, Dan. It's a fascinating story, and you are an amazing writer. And I just could not put the book down. I went to bed at 2 a.m. because I read it in one, read. So I'm going to then give the floor back to Michal, I think, right?
Wow. Well, thank you, Daniel and Emma, for this brilliant discussion. And I just want to add that, like Emma, I found the book to be completely riveting and really quite intimate, both in the way, Dan, that you take us on this journey into Greece, sort of deeply into Griesinger's upbringing, the social and political context of Stuttgart and his professional trajectory. And then your own journey, as Emma mentioned, and people asked in the audience, of uncovering this history and your position as a Jewish person who lost family in the Holocaust, and goodness, meeting the children of this Nazi. And I'll just mention, and then Dan, maybe at some point I can talk to you, but that I have someone in my family, a Jewish person, who married someone who was a Nazi. He was younger, so he's in the Nazi youth, but I found myself actually visiting from Israel, came to the US to visit, and walking into a room full of Nazi memorabilia that he was keeping in his office. Anyhow.
Wow. I had no idea. You didn't tell me that story, Michal.
Yeah,
wow. That's quite a trip.
It was, but and yeah, so I think and yeah, so again, I think and I hope everyone has a chance, as like Emma, I could not put the book down, and I think also these connections that Dan makes between the sort of racial kind of policies in the U.S. that there's been some scholars have been doing research on this particular topic of how that might have influenced Nazi policies, but that he shows us in the life of Grissinger's family is really fascinating. And just expands on this idea that Christopher Browning talked about of ordinary men, but it really expands what that means. You don't have to be in a mobile killing unit to be one of these ordinary men. So that's really it. Daniel, thanks for everyone for joining us today. And Daniel Perlman, since we have, would you like to say anything else to close?
I would also like to, echo your sentiments, Michal. Thank you so much, Dan, for speaking today. Thank you, Emma, for leading the discussion. Thank you, Michal, for being such a great partner in organizing and advertising this program. Finally, thank you to everyone who submitted questions. As a reminder, you can order the book at Classic Lines Books. Simply email classiclinesbooks@gmail.com, and the book is available for pickup, delivery, and shipping. I'll soon send everyone a short evaluation form so we can provide you with the best possible Zoom programming. We'd greatly appreciate your feedback. And finally, Classrooms Without Borders has several upcoming programs. The next film in our film series is The Day I Met Hitler, which features newly discovered stories and images of the most infamous man in history. And join us on this Thursday, October 22nd at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for a discussion with film's director Ronan Yalsky, the son of a Jewish boy who met Hitler in Berlin in 1934, and Russell Reiter, the son of Adolf Hitler's protege. We're also planning another author discussion on Sunday, November 8th with David Marwell, author of Mengele, Unmasking the Angel of Death. Information about all of our programs can be found at classroomswithoutborders.org/events. And once again, Dan, thank you so much, Emma, Michal, and thank you to everyone for attending. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you.